A presentation of AIT.
In 1917, America had gone to war, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Not just for the men and women overseas, but also for the Americans left behind on the home front. As over 2 million American soldiers boarded the transport ships bound for France, more than 1 million American women sustained the wartime labor force. A great many jobs, which had previously been considered man's work, were being filled by women. In the factory, the shipyard, and the armed forces. Women plowed the fields, fixed the cars, delivered the mail, ran the elevators and the streetcars, and even wrote the traffic tickets. President Wilson encouraged employers to pay female workers the same wages they had paid men, but few did. Even worse, when the war was over and men returned to the workforce, a great many women were fired. Other women contributed to the war effort by volunteering. They served in the Red Cross, sold Liberty Bonds, and planted victory gardens. Others, like Jane Addams and Carrie Chapman Catt, raised public awareness by actively demonstrating against war and militarism. As the war dragged on, the nation began to appreciate the valuable contribution made by women in the war effort, creating a prime opportunity for a change in women's civil liberties. On January 10th, 1917, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns of the National Women's Party took action. For almost a year, they paraded and picketed the White House, demanding passage of a constitutional amendment granting women's suffrage, the right to vote. Wilson was out of office by the time the 19th Amendment was ratified, but there was no doubt that the new role of women in America during World War I was a catalyst leading to the right to vote. Society also had to come to grips with a new role for African Americans. Like most Americans, African Americans were divided in their opinions about the war. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an editorial in The Crisis, a newspaper published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, urging African Americans to support the war effort.
Let us, while the crisis lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy.
William Monroe Trotter, editor of the Boston Guardian newspaper, disagreed. He felt African Americans were victims of racism and should not support a racist government. At home, the war contributed to the large-scale migration of more than 500,000 African Americans into the industrialized cities of the North. They provided the workforce desperately needed to produce wartime goods. In addition, immigration into America had slowed to a trickle, and many immigrants had returned to their native homelands, leaving more jobs to be filled. Despite the many women employed, companies were still short of workers. Many African Americans were anxious to leave the South and its pattern of racial discrimination, low pay, and all too often, life-threatening conditions. Between 1892 and 1919, approximately 3,000 African Americans were killed by lynching, mainly in the South. When Northern manufacturing companies sent recruiting agents with free railroad tickets into the South looking for laborers, hundreds of thousands of men and women boarded trains and headed for cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. The Chicago Defender, the most widely read African American newspaper in the South, urged Southern African Americans to come north. Some even wrote the newspaper for advice.
Dear Sir, I have a wife and one child and can hardly feed them. I thought to write and ask you for some information concerning how to get a pass for myself and family. Please don't publish this because we have to whisper this around among ourselves because the white folks are angry now because the Negroes are going north.
Able-bodied men and women came and found work in places like Henry Ford's assembly lines, where they could make as much as $5 a day, far exceeding anything African Americans could earn in the South. Despite the opportunities in the North, Black Americans found some new and some familiar problems in the North. Many blacks were forced to live in crowded, segregated housing, contributing to the rise of urban black ghettos, and they paid ridiculously high rents for the dubious privilege. African Americans were frequently denied membership in labor unions by white workers. Therefore, they were left few choices other than to accept unpopular positions as scabs or replacement workers employed during strikes. This labor struggle bred resentment among white laborers, their feelings fueled by ignorant racist opinions. Instead of competing with whites, some African Americans became entrepreneurs within the black community itself. They opened stores and insurance agencies, or offered personal services like undertaking and hairdressing. Other African American men and women, allowed few options, worked as domestic servants. In the North, a cook or a laundress earned as much money in a day as she made in a week back south. Domestic servants could earn twice as much in a northern home as a southern home. But northern homes tended to be smaller and more modern, so fewer African Americans were being hired for full-time work. Regardless, jobs, even at the lowest factory pay scale, could earn African Americans $3 a day compared to 50 cents a day in the rural South. But soon, the competition and racial tension between white and black workers led to race riots in dozens of northern cities. In July of 1917, white workers, incensed by the hiring of blacks as strikebreakers at an East St. Louis, Illinois munitions plant, ran through the streets, mindlessly stalking and killing blacks. 49 African Americans and 9 white Americans died. The New York Age reported on the march.
They marched without uttering one word or making a single gesticulation and protested in respectful silence against the reign of mob law, segregation, Jim Crowism, and many other indignities to which race is unnecessarily subjected in the United States.
Just 2 years later, a 17-year-old swam from the black beach to the white beach on the shores of Lake Michigan in Chicago. Whites threw rocks at him until he drowned. Provoked by the whites' barbaric action, blacks revolted. News of the fight reached several neighborhoods, and within hours, fighting broke out there, too. For 3 days and nights, the riot went unchecked until Illinois state troopers finally restored peace. 38 people lost their lives, 23 African American and 15 white, with another 520 citizens injured. James Weldon Johnson, diplomat, poet, novelist, critic, and composer, said the summer of 1919 was the red summer of hate for the bloodshed in racial violence. White America was learning what black Americans had known all along. Racial prejudice wasn't a problem confined to the South. It was an American problem. And African Americans weren't the only ones whose civil liberties were being abused. Once war was declared, conformity, patriotism, and complete support for the war were demanded of all Americans. Freedom of speech and thought was becoming unacceptable. Different language and culture suspicious. German Americans in particular were scrutinized and their loyalty questioned. Schools dropped German from their language classes. German books were withdrawn from public libraries. German measles was renamed Liberty Measles, and sauerkraut, Liberty Cabbage. Frederick Stock, the distinguished conductor of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, was not allowed to conduct, and many other orchestras refused to play the music of Bach and Beethoven. Soon these sentiments manifested into anti-German violence. The most notorious case occurred in Collinsville, Illinois, when German-born Robert Prager was lynched. Intolerance spread beyond German Americans. William Harding, then governor of Iowa, made a brash proclamation.
Conversation in public places, on trains, or over the telephone should be in the English language.
People who spoke Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Czech, on top of those who spoke German, were affected. Elderly women were jailed for speaking German over the telephone. A Lutheran pastor was imprisoned for preaching part of a funeral service for a soldier killed in the war in Swedish. His explanation that he did it because the young man's grandparents couldn't speak English did not sway the judge. Governor Harding even maintained that God did not hear prayers that were spoken in any language other than English. In June of 1917, Congress passed and President Wilson signed the Espionage Act, and 11 months later, the Sedition Act. Under these laws, a person could be fined as much as $10,000 and could be sentenced to as many as 20 years in prison for anti-war activities, like interfering with the draft or with the sale of government bonds. Imprisonment could result from saying anything disloyal, profane, or abusive concerning the war effort. Despite the fact that these two acts violated the First Amendment to the Constitution, the right of free speech, the Supreme Court upheld their constitutionality, claiming that there was a clear and present danger to free speech and a free press during a war. The result was that citizens were harassed purely upon suspicion. Walter Matthey was jailed for the high crime of attending an anti-war meeting and contributing a quarter to the cause. Under the act, the post office could censor the mail, and over 400 periodicals were banned for a time, including the Saturday Evening Post and the New York Times. Robert Goldstein ran afoul of the law with his film, The Spirit of 76. It was just a silent movie about the Revolutionary War, and of course the British were portrayed as America's enemy. Now, however, America and Great Britain were allies, and Goldstein was told to remove scenes of British soldiers shooting colonists. He refused and was sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Goldstein served 3 years, and his career never recovered. But the worst treatment under the Espionage and Sedition Acts was reserved for socialists and labor leaders. The founder of the Socialist Party and frequent presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment on each of 3 counts to be served concurrently for his outspoken opposition to the war.
I have been accused of obstructing the war, I admit it. Gentlemen, I abhor war.
Undaunted, Debs ran for president from his jail cell in the Atlanta prison in 1920 and got almost 1 million votes. In 1921, President Warren Harding commuted his sentence. Emma Goldman, an anarchist, a person who believes there should be no government, was fined $10,000 and given 2 years in jail for denouncing the draft. On her release, she was promptly deported to Russia. Labor organizer Big Bill Haywood was convicted of sabotaging the war effort because he encouraged workers to strike for fair pay and decent working conditions. Haywood received a sentence of 20 years for his troubles, but jumped bail and fled to Russia, where he remained until his death 10 years later. On President Wilson's last day in office, Congress repealed the Sedition Act. Ironically, while American soldiers fought for freedom in Europe, freedom of speech and civil liberties were being denied to Americans at home. Thankfully, the war was coming to a conclusion. Russia had already withdrawn from the battle after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Allied forces had aided the anti-Bolsheviks, however, and this led to long-term mistrust between Russia and the Allies. By November of 1918, the Allies, with fresh new American forces, began to turn the tide of battle, and German soldiers began to retreat along the Western Front. The German Navy ordered its fleet to set out to sea, but the sailors refused. In Germany, soldiers and civilians started organizing revolutionary councils. The people of Berlin rebelled against the Kaiser, who abdicated his throne and escaped to the Netherlands. No final, decisive battle was fought. No Allied soldiers entered German territory. Instead, the German war machine ground to a halt. On the 11th hour of the 11th day, in the 11th month of 1918, Germany agreed to a ceasefire that ended the war. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace fighter pilot, flew over the trenches when the armistice was declared.
On both sides of no man's land, the trenches erupted. Brown uniformed men poured out of the American trenches, gray-green uniforms out of the German. I watched them throw their helmets in the air, discard their guns, wave their hands. Suddenly, gray uniforms mixed with brown. I could see them hugging each other, dancing, jumping.
The bloodiest war to date was finally over. During its 4 long years, more than 30 nations participated in battle and in death. But even as the war ended, Americans faced still another crisis. A crisis at home that took more lives than the war itself. A flu epidemic gripped the country, and approximately 25% of the population fell ill with high fevers, headaches, and often pneumonia. About 500,000 Americans died. Businesses shut down, telephone service was curtailed, and corpses lay unburied due to a shortage of coffins. The epidemic, like the war, finally subsided, and a weary America looked to President Wilson and the victorious Allies to deliver a lasting peace. Even before the war was over, Wilson had presented his plan for peace to Congress, his 14 points speech.
We entered this war because violations of right had occurred, which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible.
Wilson's first 5 points dealt with the issues he felt had caused the war. Nations should no longer engage in secret treaties. The freedom of the seas must be restored, and tariffs should be lowered or removed altogether so free trade could flourish. Wilson demanded an end to the arms race and stockpiling of weapons. He declared that the interest and desires of people living in colonies should be considered by the imperialist countries who ruled them. Wilson's next points addressed boundary changes. Advocating the principle of self-determination, Wilson wanted any new national boundaries to be drawn along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality. His last point was the most important to Wilson. He called for the formation of a League of Nations to keep world peace. The members of the League would agree to protect each other from aggression and settle grievances without going to war. Following the ceasefire in December of 1918, Wilson and his wife Edith sailed aboard the SS George Washington for Europe to attend the Versailles Peace Conference. It was the first time in history that an American president left the United States while in office. Wilson was given a hero's welcome. Crowds cheered him. The citizens of Europe saw Wilson as their best hope for a lasting world peace. But the politicians of Europe, particularly British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who had won election on the slogan, "Make Germany Pay," and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, who had lived through 2 German invasions of France, resisted most of Wilson's ideas. To them, the first and foremost goal of the peace treaty was to punish Germany so she could never wage war again. The peace conference did not include the defeated Central Powers, Russia, and the smaller Allied countries. The so-called Big Four, America, Great Britain, France, and Italy, hammered out the peace treaty among themselves. Time and again, Wilson was forced to concede on elements of his 14 points in return for the establishment of the League of Nations. Finally, on June 28, 1919, the Big Four, along with the leaders of the defeated nations, met at the Palace of Versailles to sign the treaty. The Treaty of Versailles created 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, while the borders of other countries were redrawn. 4 sections of the Ottoman Empire were made temporary colonies under the rule of France and Great Britain until they were ready for independence. President Wilson did manage to prevent some of the more extreme punishments, but the treaty demilitarized Germany, banning her air force and navy and limiting her army to only 100,000 men. Germany was ordered to return Alsace-Lorraine to France. Most debilitating, Germany had to pay reparations, war damages, of $33 billion to the Allies, and admit total responsibility for the war. Certainly, Germany had played a major role in starting World War I, but other countries were equally involved. German citizens found the treaty outrageous, and there was no way the country could ever repay the Allies the money demanded. Instead of providing a lasting peace, the Treaty of Versailles began laying the groundwork for World War II. Wilson returned home to even more disappointment. Instead of enthusiastic support for the treaty and the League of Nations, he found most Americans were now disinterested in foreign policy and wanted to return to the pre-war atmosphere of isolationism. The Republican-controlled Congress, led by Wilson's adversary, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, insisted Wilson alter some of the provisions of the treaty. Wilson was equally stubborn and refused even the smallest compromise. In turn, Wilson, despite the advice of his doctors and close friends that his health was fragile, took his proposals directly to the public. He set out on an 8,000-mile tour of the nation, delivering 35 speeches in 22 days to convince Americans that the treaty deserved approval. He hoped public opinion would force the Senate to agree to the treaty and join the League of Nations. Americans greeted him as enthusiastically as had the Europeans. In late September of 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, he ended his speech by saying to the crowd,
"There seems to me to stand between us and the rejection or qualification of this treaty the serried ranks of those boys in khaki, not only those boys who came home, but those dear ghosts that still deploy upon the fields of France."
The campaign, however, proved too much for President Woodrow Wilson. On October 2nd, he collapsed and was rushed back to the White House. Wilson lay as an invalid as a result of his stroke for more than 2 months. Still, the Senate failed to ratify the treaty. The United States Senate eventually signed a separate peace treaty with Germany, but never joined Wilson's beloved League of Nations. 3 amendments were passed during the Wilson administration. The 17th, providing direct election of senators, the 18th, outlawing alcohol, and the 19th, granting suffrage for women. He is remembered for his progressive reforms, for his failed attempt to convince the Senate to join the League of Nations, and for his prophecy of 1919 that proved chillingly correct 20 years later.
I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war if the nations of the world do not concert the method by which to prevent it.
America remained an observer at League of Nations meetings, But without U.S. participation, the League lacked clout and eventually faltered. World War I had left the country saddened over the loss of so many lives, deeply divided about the League of Nations and what was to be America's role in a global community. Weary of war and the wrenching social upheavals of the Progressive Era, Americans longed for a return to what new President Warren G. Harding called normalcy. The next decade, the 1920s, would bring a brief time of prosperity, new personal freedoms, and stunning social changes. An era forever known as the Roaring Twenties.